Cruising at 35,000 feet, Flight 882 was a mundane red-eye until twin F-22 Raptors sliced through the clouds, locking their sights on the Boeing 737. Panic ripped through the cabin as the heavily armed fighter jets boxed the commercial airliner into a deadly corner, their missiles locked and ready. Amidst the screaming passengers sat a petite, unassuming 20-something in an oversized college hoodie, quietly clutching her armrests. Everyone in the cabin thought she was just a terrified teenager. No one knew she was the military's deadliest asset in the sky, until the radio crackled over the PA system, demanding the girl in seat 7A by her classified call sign. Sunlight filtered harshly through the scratched acrylic of the window at seat 7A, casting long, dusty shadows across the narrow economy-class cabin of Oceanic Airlines Flight 492. The Boeing 737 was packed to capacity, flying a routine route from Seattle to Anchorage, Alaska. Wedged into the window seat was Jessica Gallagher, with her knees pulled up to her chest, swimming in a faded gray university hoodie with the hood pulled low over her messy blonde bun. She looked exactly like a stressed-out college sophomore heading home for the holidays. She wore no makeup, her pale face framed by cheap wire-rimmed glasses, and she possessed a fragile, petite frame that made the notoriously cramped airline seats look almost spacious. Beside her in seat 7B sat Richard Lawson. Richard was a man who practically radiated self-importance, clad in a crisp, tailored navy suit, wearing an expensive silver watch that he made a point of checking every 5 minutes. He had spent the first hour of the flight aggressively typing on his laptop and loudly ordering scotch from the passing flight attendants. When he finally closed his laptop, he turned his sights on Jessica. "First time flying alone, sweetie?" Richard asked, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for toddlers. He flashed a brilliant, rehearsed smile. "You've been gripping that armrest since takeoff. Don't worry, the pilots know what they're doing up there. It's basically just a big bus." Jessica turned her head slowly, adjusting her glasses. She offered a small, nervous smile, playing the part perfectly. "Just not a big fan of turbulence," she muttered softly, shrinking back against the bulkhead. "Well, if it gets bumpy, you just take deep breaths," Richard lectured, leaning back and crossing his legs. "I fly 100,000 miles a year, platinum medallion status. I can tell you there's absolutely nothing to be afraid of. You just leave the heavy lifting to the men in the cockpit." Jessica nodded meekly and turned back to the window. If Richard had bothered to look closely, he might have noticed that her eyes weren't squeezed shut in fear. They were tracking the horizon with predatory precision. Her grip on the armrest wasn't from panic. It was muscle memory, grounding herself to feel the micro-vibrations of the airframe. Despite her youthful appearance, Captain Jessica Gallagher was 28 years old and currently on forced administrative leave from the United States Air Force. She wasn't a college student. She was an elite combat aviator, one of the few women in the world certified to fly the F-22 Raptor, a fifth-generation stealth tactical fighter. Beneath the oversized hoodie, her shoulder carried a deep, bruised indentation from a recent high-G maneuver that had nearly ripped the wings off her jet during a classified dogfight over the Pacific. An incident her superiors deemed too close for comfort, resulting in a mandatory 2-week psychological evaluation and leave. To Jessica, the Boeing 737 felt absurdly sluggish. As she stared out at the sprawling white canvas of the clouds below, she wasn't just daydreaming. She was actively diagnosing the aircraft. She could feel a subtle, rhythmic shudder in the floorboards beneath her sneakers. The high-pitched whine of the right-side CFM56 turbofan engine was oscillating by a fraction of a decibel. The pitch was wrong. Furthermore, she noticed the aircraft's angle of attack was unusually high for their cruising altitude, and the ailerons outside her window were making constant, jittery corrections. The yaw damper is fighting something, she thought, her brow furrowing slightly, and were bleeding airspeed. She glanced at her watch, a rugged, matte black tactical timepiece hidden under her hoodie sleeve. They were supposed to be flying a steady heading over the Canadian coastline, but the sun's angle through her window had shifted significantly over the last 10 minutes. "Excuse me," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper, trying to get the attention of a passing flight attendant named Nancy. "Are we changing course?" Richard scoffed loudly before the flight attendant could answer. Oh, for heaven's sake. They're just vectoring around some weather. Look, kid, don't start hyperventilating and causing a scene. Nancy here has real work to do." Nancy gave Jessica a sympathetic, patronizing smile. "The gentleman is right, honey. Just relax and watch a movie. Would you like a ginger ale?" "No, thank you," Jessica replied, her voice tightening just a fraction. She turned back to the window. The subtle shudder in the floorboards was no longer subtle. It was turning into a distinctive, heavy vibration. The aircraft wasn't just vectoring around weather. They were descending, slowly, silently, without any announcement from the flight deck. And worse, they were banking hard to the west, heading straight out over the open, freezing expanse of the northern Pacific Ocean. Jessica closed her eyes, visualizing the cockpit instrumentation. Thrust is dropping. We've deviated from the flight corridor by at least 40 degrees. Why hasn't Seattle Center corrected us? Something was fundamentally, dangerously wrong on Flight 492. The shift went from subtle to terrifying in the span of 30 seconds. The Boeing 737 suddenly pitched forward violently, the nose dropping at a sickening angle. Unsecured cups, phones, and magazines launched into the air. Passengers shrieked as zero gravity lifted them against their seatbelts. Richard's glass of scotch flew out of his hand, shattering against the ceiling panel and showering him in amber liquid and ice. "What the hell is going on?" he bellowed, his previous confident demeanor vanishing instantly, replaced by wide-eyed primal terror. The aircraft leveled out just as violently, slamming everyone back into their seats with bone-jarring force. The overhead compartments rattled furiously, a few popping open to spill carry-on luggage into the aisles. The cabin lights flickered, died, and were replaced by the eerie, dim glow of emergency track lighting running along the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened," Nancy yelled, her voice trembling over the chaos as she gripped the back of an aisle seat, her knuckles white. Jessica didn't scream. She didn't flinch or flee. Her hands moved systematically, tightening her seatbelt to maximum tension, her eyes darting across the cabin to assess the structural integrity of the bulkheads. She looked out the window. The sky had darkened, the bright sunlight replaced by a heavy gray overcast as they dove into a thick cloud bank. "No oxygen masks," she noted clinically. "Cabin pressure is intact." But that was a negative G dive, uncontrolled. The autopilot is off, and whoever is flying this thing just panicked. "We're going to crash. The pilots are asleep or dead." A woman 3 rows back started screaming hysterically. "Shut up. Everyone shut up," Richard yelled, his face pale and sweating. He turned to Jessica, his eyes frantic. "You feel that, right? The engines sound weird." "They're spooled down to flight idle," Jessica said. Her voice had changed. The timid, whispering college girl was gone. Her tone was sharp, flat, and chillingly authoritative. "We're gliding, and we're completely off the grid." Before Richard could process her sudden shift in demeanor, a shadow passed over Jessica's window. It was so fast, so massive, that it temporarily blocked out the ambient light bouncing off the clouds. "What was that?" Richard gasped, leaning over Jessica to look out. Jessica leaned her head against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. She knew exactly what it was. Her heart, which had remained steady through the violent dive, suddenly spiked in her chest. Emerging from the gray mist off the left wingtip of the Boeing 737 was a machine born of pure violence and cutting-edge aerodynamics. It was an F-22 Raptor. The twin-engined stealth tactical fighter hovered in the air with terrifying grace, its sleek, radar-absorbent gray skin slicing through the moisture like a shark through water. It was so close that Jessica could see the intricate panel lines on its fuselage and the lethal, angular geometry of its twin tails. Screams erupted on the left side of the cabin as passengers spotted the fighter jet. "Military! It's the military!" someone shouted. A second shadow fell over the right side of the plane. Jessica craned her neck, confirming what she already knew. Wingman. A second F-22 had taken up position on their right flank, boxing them in. "Thank God," Richard panted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "They're here to help us. They're escorting us to an airport." "They're not here to help us, Richard," Jessica said coldly, her eyes fixed on the left side Raptor. "What do you mean?" "They're the Air Force." "Look under its wings," Jessica commanded, pointing a slender finger at the glass. "The weapon bay doors are open." Richard squinted, his breath hitching. The internal weapon bays of the F-22, usually sealed flush to maintain its stealth profile, were hinged open. Protruding from the belly of the beast were the unmistakable, deadly shapes of AIM-9X Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. "They have missiles out," Richard stammered, shrinking back into his seat. "Why would they do that?" "Because we are a heavy aircraft, flying dark, off course, and descending toward restricted airspace," Jessica said, her mind racing through the intercept protocols she had memorized and executed dozens of times. "Flight 492 hasn't responded to air traffic control. We are a rogue vector. To them, we aren't a passenger plane anymore. We're a guided missile." Out the window, the F-22 pilot initiated a maneuver. The massive fighter jet dipped its left wing, then its right, a violent, rocking motion. "Wing waggle," Jessica translated instantly. Visual command. "You have been intercepted. Follow me." She waited for the Boeing to bank, to follow the fighter jet's command. 10 seconds passed. 20. The 737 maintained its straight, descending, dead-end trajectory. "Come on, Miller," Jessica thought, recalling the name of the commercial captain from the pre-flight announcement. "Acknowledge the intercept. Rock your wings. Do something." Instead, the Boeing's engine suddenly roared to life, pitching up aggressively and banking hard to the right, directly toward the second F-22. It was an erratic, incredibly dangerous move, the kind of maneuver a disoriented or hostile pilot makes when trying to evade. The right side F-22 banked away sharply to avoid a mid-air collision, its afterburners igniting into twin cones of blue fire as it vanished into the clouds. The left side Raptor instantly dropped back, taking up a firing position directly behind the tail of the Boeing 737. "They're getting into the saddle," Jessica whispered, dread pooling in her stomach. "They've achieved missile lock." "Who are you?" Richard demanded, finally noticing that the terrified teenager next to him was narrating a military interception with the clinical detachment of a combat veteran. Jessica ignored him. She unbuckled her seatbelt. She had to get to the cockpit. The commercial pilots were either unconscious, hijacked, or severely experiencing spatial disorientation. In less than 2 minutes, the F-22s were going to receive authorization from NORAD to blow Flight 492 out of the sky. Jessica shoved past a paralyzed Richard, stepping into the aisle. The cabin was a scene of utter pandemonium. Oxygen masks had finally deployed, dropping from the ceiling like yellow plastic snakes. Though the cabin was still pressurized, passengers were crying, praying, and clutching each other. Nancy, the flight attendant, was backed against the forward galley divider, speaking frantically into the intercom handset. Jessica moved up the aisle, her balance perfect despite the heavy, unnatural tilting of the aircraft. She reached Nancy, placing a firm hand on the older woman's shoulder. "I need you to open the flight deck door," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the noise with absolute command. Nancy stared at her, tears streaking her mascara. "Oh, what? No. Sit down. Are you crazy? It's locked. We're under federal regulations." "Nancy, listen to me," Jessica interrupted, locking eyes with the flight attendant. "The men flying those jets outside are going to shoot us down in exactly 90 seconds if someone doesn't get this plane on a compliant vector. Open the door." I can't. Captain Miller isn't answering the interphone." First Officer Thompson sounded panicked. He said Miller passed out, and then nothing. Before Jessica could formulate a plan to breach the reinforced Kevlar door, the aircraft's PA system emitted a deafening, piercing squeal of static. Everyone in the cabin covered their ears. The first officer in the cockpit had accidentally keyed the PA microphone open while frantically trying to tune the emergency radio frequencies. Suddenly, the panicked, hyperventilating voice of First Officer Thompson echoed through the cabin. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Oceanic 492. Captain is incapacitated. I have complete gyro failure. My instruments are spinning. I can't see the horizon. Please, Seattle Center, I'm flying blind." Then a new voice cut through the static over the PA. It wasn't the frantic commercial pilot. It was calm, deep, and chillingly steady, broadcasting on the International Guard frequency of 121.5 megahertz, which Thompson had inadvertently patched directly to the cabin speakers. "Oceanic 492. This is Raptor 1. You are entering restricted military airspace over Naval Base Kitsap. You have ignored visual intercept commands and made hostile evasive maneuvers. If you do not immediately comply and turn to a heading of 090, you will be fired upon. Acknowledge immediately." The passengers screamed in renewed horror. They were hearing their own death sentence broadcast live. "I can't," Thompson's voice sobbed over the intercom. "My instruments are dead. I don't know which way is 090. I'm in the clouds. I'm spiraling." Jessica cursed under her breath. Spatial disorientation. Without visual reference in the thick clouds, and with failed gyroscopes, Thompson literally didn't know which way was up. His inner ear was lying to him, causing him to throw the plane into a death spiral. Jessica turned and sprinted back to her seat in 7A. Richard cowered as she leaned over him, practically pressing her face against the cold glass of the window. The left side F-22 had moved back alongside them, flying dangerously close, trying to assess the cockpit visually. Jessica recognized the tail markings, the intricate dice insignia painted on the vertical stabilizer, the 90th Fighter Squadron. The Dice Men, based out of Elmendorf. These were her boys. Jessica pulled her smartphone from her pocket. There was no cell service, but she didn't need it. She activated the flashlight app, switching it to maximum brightness. She pressed the phone's LED directly against the thick window pane to prevent the light from reflecting back into her eyes. She began tapping the screen, turning the blinding white light on and off in rapid, precise sequences. Flash, 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 flash. She was signaling in tactical Morse code, a specific brevity code used exclusively by the pilots of the 90th Squadron when operating under total radio silence. THISVALKYRIE, Valkyrie, her call sign. In the cockpit of the F-22, Major Cole Stryker Harrison was resting his thumb on the weapon release button. His targeting computer was screaming in his ear, a solid tone indicating a deadly lock on the 737's right engine. He was 10 seconds away from pulling the trigger and ending the lives of 200 innocent people to save thousands on the ground. He glanced sideways at the Boeing's fuselage one last time, and then he saw it. A rhythmic, piercing strobe of white light originating from a window just over the wing. Seat 7A. Stryker frowned behind his oxygen mask. He watched the flashes. THISISVALKYRIE. Stryker's blood ran cold. Valkyrie, Captain Jessica Gallagher, the prodigy, the absolute best stick and rudder pilot in the United States Air Force. He knew she was on leave, taking a commercial flight to Anchorage today. He keyed his radio, his voice suddenly sharp, abandoning the calm military cadence. Over the PA system inside the Boeing, the passengers heard Stryker's voice boom with terrifying authority. Oceanic 492, listen to me very carefully. You have a United States Air Force captain in your cabin. She is sitting in seat 7A. Her call sign is Valkyrie. The entire cabin went dead silent, save for the roar of the engines. 200 pairs of eyes, including Richard's terrified, bulging eyes, slowly turned to look at the petite blonde girl in the oversized college hoodie still pressing her phone against the window. First Officer Thompson, the F-22 pilot, continued, his voice echoing like the wrath of God through the speakers. You will open your flight deck door right now. You will get the girl in 7A into the left seat, and you will give her the controls. If Valkyrie is not flying that aircraft in 60 seconds, I am blowing you out of the sky. Raptor 1, out. Richard sat paralyzed, his jaw practically on the floor. He looked at Jessica, his mind completely unable to reconcile the condescending remarks he had made earlier with the reality sitting beside him. Jessica lowered her phone. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't look at the staring passengers. She unzipped her oversized hoodie, shrugging it off to reveal a tight, olive drab tactical t-shirt underneath. Her demeanor was no longer that of a frightened kid. Her eyes were entirely devoid of fear, replaced by the lethal, calculating focus of an apex predator. "Nancy," Jessica barked, her voice cracking like a whip through the silent cabin. "Get that door open, now." Nancy's hands shook so violently, she dropped the plastic interphone receiver. The heavy, pressurized silence of the cabin had been entirely shattered by the ultimatum delivered from the fighter pilot outside. The passengers were paralyzed, holding their breath, their eyes darting between the armed F-22 Raptor holding formation just beyond the glass and the young blonde woman standing in the aisle. "Nancy," Jessica repeated, her voice dropping an octave, radiating the icy practiced calm of a combat commander. "We have less than 45 seconds before Major Harrison puts a Sidewinder missile through the fuselage. You need to punch in the emergency access code, now." Tears streamed down the senior flight attendant's face, but the sheer, unwavering authority in Jessica's eyes broke through her panic. Nancy pivoted toward the reinforced Kevlar door, separating the cabin from the flight deck. She lifted a trembling finger and punched a 4-digit sequence into the digital keypad. A high-pitched chime echoed, followed by a mechanical clunk as the heavy deadbolts retracted. Jessica slammed her palm against the door, shoving it inward. The moment the seal broke, a wall of deafening noise assaulted them. The cockpit was a symphony of automated terror. The master caution lights were flashing a blinding amber, and the ground proximity warning system was screaming its synthetic, robotic chant over and over. Terrain, terrain, pull up, beep, 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 bank angle, pull up. The flight deck was a chaotic mess of loose charts, spilled coffee, and panicked movement. In the left seat, Captain William Miller was slumped forward against the yoke, completely unresponsive. A dark streak of crimson stained his crisp white collar, blood from a severely ruptured eardrum or a massive nasal hemorrhage, indicating a sudden and localized pressure failure that had likely rendered him unconscious instantly. In the right seat, First Officer Brian Thompson was entirely consumed by spatial disorientation. His hands were hovering inches away from the control wheel, trembling wildly. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at his primary flight display. "The horizon is gone," Thompson shrieked, oblivious to Jessica entering the cramped space. "We're inverted. I can't feel the deck. I'm pulling, but it won't go up." Jessica stepped over the center pedestal, her eyes instantly scanning the instrument panels. Thompson's digital displays were scrambled, feeding him entirely false attitude and heading data, a cascading catastrophic failure of the air. Data inertial reference system. His inner ear, compromised by the violent descent and the lack of visual cues outside the foggy windshield, was telling his brain they were flipping backward. He was experiencing the leans, one of the deadliest psychological phenomenons in aviation. If he had grabbed the controls, his instinct would have been to push the nose down further, driving them directly into the earth. "Thompson, let go of the controls," Jessica barked. She didn't wait for him to process the command. She grabbed Captain Miller by the shoulder harness. "Nancy, get in here. Haul him out of the seat. Pull." The flight attendant grabbed the unconscious captain's belt, and together, fighting the unnatural gravity of their steep descent, they hauled the dead weight of the 200-pound man out of the commander's chair. Miller slumped onto the floor of the galley area behind the cockpit. Jessica threw herself into the left seat. It was soaked in the captain's spilled coffee, but she didn't care. She didn't bother with the 4-point harness. She simply grabbed the heavy dual-horned yoke with both hands and planted her sneakers firmly on the rudder pedals. "Pull up, pull up." The automated voice was insistent, frantic. Jessica ignored the dead glass screens in front of her. She looked up at the center dashboard, zeroing in on the integrated standby flight display, the tiny, mechanical backup instruments that operated independently of the ship's main computers. Pitch, 42 degrees nose down. Bank, 50 degrees right. Airspeed, 410 knots. Approaching structural red line. They were falling like a stone, tearing through the thick Pacific cloud bank. "I have the aircraft," Jessica announced out loud, the mandatory verbal handoff acting as a grounding mechanism for her own adrenaline. Flying an F-22 Raptor was like strapping into a lightning bolt. It responded to millimeter inputs with instantaneous, fly-by-wire aggression. The Boeing 737 currently loaded with tens of thousands of pounds of fuel and passengers, was a sluggish, heavy beast. To pull it out of a dive required raw physical strength. Jessica gritted her teeth, her biceps straining as she wrestled the heavy yoke to the left, fighting the intense aerodynamic forces pressing against the ailerons. The airframe groaned, a terrifying, deep, metallic shudder that vibrated through the floorboards. "Come on, you heavy pig, level out," she growled. The standby artificial horizon began to shallow out. 50 degrees, 30 degrees, level bank. "Bank is level," Jessica shouted over the alarms. Thrust levers to idle. Speed brakes deployed. She slammed the thrust levers back to flight idle with her right hand, pulling the speed brake lever to create maximum aerodynamic drag. The aircraft shuddered violently as the panels on the wings popped up, biting into the rushing air to slow their catastrophic descent. "Pulling up," she announced. Jessica pulled back on the yoke. It felt as if she were trying to deadlift a truck. The hydraulic systems were fighting against the extreme dynamic pressure building outside the aircraft. The G-forces hit instantly, pressing her deep into the captain's seat. Behind her, Nancy collapsed onto the floor, pinned by the sudden gravitational weight. 3,000 feet. The altimeter was unwinding insanely fast. 2,000 feet. Suddenly, the gray fog obscuring the windshield vanished. Flight 492 punched through the bottom layer of the cloud deck, directly beneath them. Raging in a violent winter squall was the dark, churning surface of the northern Pacific Ocean. The white-capped waves were terrifyingly close, rushing up to meet the nose of the plane. "Brace!" Thompson screamed, finally seeing the real horizon. Jessica didn't blink. She maintained a steady, agonizing pull on the yoke, playing the very edge of an aerodynamic stall. If she pulled too hard, the wings would lose their lift and they would drop into the sea. If she pulled too gently, they would simply fly into the water. The nose of the Boeing groaned upward. The massive jet skimmed over the surface of the ocean, leveling out at a terrifyingly low 800 feet. The spray from the storm below actually speckled the heavy glass of the windshield. Jessica held the yoke steady, her chest heaving as she finally allowed herself a single, ragged breath. The GPWS alarm mercifully silenced. The cockpit was left with only the heavy roar of the wind over the fuselage and the hyperventilating sobs of First Officer Thompson. "Aircraft is level and stable at 800 feet, Jessica said, her voice dropping back to its cold, clinical baseline. She reached up to the overhead panel, her fingers flying over the switches, immediately locking out the malfunctioning air data computers to prevent them from feeding bad data to the autopilot. She keyed the radio transmitter on the yoke, tuning it to the 121.5 megahertz guard frequency. "Raptor 1, Oceanic 492. Valkyrie has the jet. We are level. Angel 0.8 maintaining heading. Acknowledge." For 5 agonizing seconds, the radio produced only the harsh hiss of static. Jessica stared out the left window, searching the dark, rain-streaked sky above the ocean for the silhouette of the fighter jet. Then the radio cracked, and the deep, familiar voice of Major Cole Stryker Harrison flooded the cockpit. "Valkyrie, Raptor 1. Good to hear your voice, Jess. Visual contact. I'm sliding into the saddle on your right wing. NORAD has been holding their breath. Tell them to exhale, Stryker. The commercial crew experienced a massive avionics failure and severe spatial disorientation. The captain is incapacitated. I have positive control of the aircraft, but we are flying entirely on standby instruments." A shadow eclipsed the right side of the Boeing. Jessica leaned over the center console, looking out First Officer Thompson's window. Emerging from the driving rain, the massive F-22 Raptor slid into perfect formation, its wingtip mere yards from the window. The weapon bays had been sealed shut. Stryker was no longer an executioner. He was an escort. Thompson stared at the lethal gray warbird hovering outside his window, his mouth open in stunned silence. He slowly turned his head to look at the young woman in the oversized gray hoodie sitting in the captain's chair. Who are you?" Thompson whispered, his voice cracking. "Right now, I'm the only thing keeping you out of the Pacific," Jessica replied bluntly, not taking her eyes off her standby instruments. "Get your headset on, First Officer. I need you running checklists. Start with the IRS alignment protocol. We need navigation back." Thompson nodded numbly, scrambling to put his headset on. "Oceanic 492, Raptor 1. Stryker's voice returned, his tone shifting back to strict military protocol. Be advised, you are currently on a direct heading for Naval Base Kitsap. Due to current DEFCON protocols, WADS command requires you to alter heading immediately. Turn right to heading 040. We are vectoring you to McCord Field for emergency landing." Jessica frowned. She gently applied pressure to the right rudder pedal and turned the yoke. The Boeing responded, but it felt incredibly wrong. The control column vibrated erratically and the nose sluggishly fought the turn. She had to apply an extreme amount of cross-control to prevent the right wing from dipping too far. "Raptor 1, Oceanic 492, Jessica transmitted, her brow furrowing. "Negative on the turn. I have a severe flight control binding issue. It feels like I'm dragging an anchor off the right side. I need you to drop back and give me a visual damage assessment." "Copy, Valkyrie, sliding back." Outside the window, the F-22 decelerated, dropping behind the tail of the massive commercial airliner. Jessica maintained her agonizingly low altitude, wrestling the yoke just to keep the plane flying in a straight line through the turbulence of the storm. "Valkyrie, Stryker," the radio crackled. This time Harrison's voice was tight with genuine concern. "You have structural damage. The high G pullout tore the fairings off your right horizontal stabilizer. Your right elevator is jammed at a 5-degree upward deflection. You also have severe fluid leaking from the right wing root. Looks like you severed a primary hydraulic line." Jessica cursed silently. That explained the extreme heaviness of the controls. With a jammed elevator and failing hydraulics, the Boeing 737 was essentially crippled. "Understood, Stryker. Hydraulic pressure is dropping on System B. I cannot execute standard banking maneuvers, and I don't have the lift authority to climb back over the weather." "Copy that. Stand by." Inside the F-22, Stryker was patched directly to Colonel Robert Henderson at the Western Air Defense Sector Command Center in Washington. "Colonel, the commercial jet is crippled," Stryker reported, his eyes glued to his heads-up display as he tracked the massive airliner skimming the waves. "Valkyrie is flying it manually, but she can't climb and she can't execute a tight turn. They are trapped under this squall line." "Major Harrison," Colonel Henderson's voice boomed over the secure frequency. "I don't care who is flying that plane. They are 5 minutes away from penetrating the exclusion zone around Kitsap. We have 3 nuclear submarines currently surfaced in the inlet. If that Boeing crosses the perimeter, I have strict orders from the Pentagon. You are to shoot it down." "Sir, there are 200 civilians on board and one of our own pilots at the stick," Stryker argued, his grip tightening on his control stick. "Major, if she can't turn the plane, you don't have a choice. Get her on a new vector, or I will authorize Raptor 2 to take the shot." Stryker switched back to the guard frequency. "Valkyrie, this is Stryker. NORAD is drawing a hard line in the sand. You cannot maintain this heading. If you enter the Kitsap exclusion zone, they will fire. You have to turn. Jessica gripped the yoke, staring at the dark ocean rushing past. I told you, Stryker, the elevator is jammed. If I try to bank right using only the ailerons at this low air speed, the asymmetric drag is going to snap roll this plane right into the water. Then we use the engines, Stryker said, his voice deadly calm. Asymmetric thrust, Jess. You fly the pitch with the yoke, you steer with the throttles, just like we practiced in the simulator when they blew our tails off. Jessica smiled grimly. That was in a fighter jet, Cole. Not a 70-ton bus. You're the best stick in the squadron, Valkyrie. Prove it. I'm moving to your left wing. We are going to fly a tethered formation. You match my movements. I'll guide you through the storm. The F-22 reappeared, sliding in tight on the left side of the Boeing. The proximity was terrifying. The fighter jet was close enough that Jessica could clearly see the dark visor of Stryker's helmet staring back at her through the rain. "First Officer Thompson," Jessica commanded, her eyes locked on the fighter jet outside her window. "I need you to manage the throttles. When I say left, you push the left throttle forward and pull the right one back. We are going to steer this plane using only engine power." Thompson swallowed hard, gripping the dual throttle levers on the center console. "Okay, I'm ready." "Stryker, we are formed up," Jessica transmitted. "Walk me through the fire." "Copy. Initiating shallow right turn. Now." The F-22 banked gently away from them. "Left throttle forward, right throttle back. Give me 10% differential," Jessica shouted. Thompson shoved the levers. The massive CFM56 turbofan engines spooled up unevenly. The Boeing shuddered violently, protesting the unnatural aerodynamic forces. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose of the massive airliner began to drag to the right, steering away from the restricted military airspace and heading deeper into the blinding fury of the Pacific storm. Sweat stung Jessica's eyes as she wrestled with the heavy yoke. 50 tons of crippled aluminum groaned under the sheer aerodynamic stress of the unconventional maneuver. Steering a commercial airliner using only differential engine power was like trying to parallel park a freight train on an ice rink. Every microscopic adjustment to the throttles resulted in a delayed, sluggish yaw that threatened to send the Boeing 737 spiraling out of control. "More right throttle, Thompson. Give me another 5%. Jessica shouted over the deafening roar of the wind, hammering the windshield. Beside her, First Officer Brian Thompson was drenched in perspiration. His hands shook violently, but he gripped the throttle quadrant with white-knuckled determination. He shoved the right lever forward while retarding the left. The aircraft shuddered, protesting the asymmetric thrust, but the nose grudgingly continued its agonizingly slow sweep toward the east. Outside the left window, Major Cole Stryker Harrison flew his F-22 Raptor with predatory precision. He maintained a distance of barely 30 feet from the Boeing's wingtip, matching their sluggish speed and awkward crab angle perfectly. To the passengers staring out the windows, the sleek, gray fighter jet looked like an angel of death tethered to their side. To Jessica, Stryker was her only anchor in a sky that wanted to kill them. "Hold it right there, Valkyrie." Stryker's voice crackled through the headset, remarkably calm despite the terrifying proximity. "You're tracking 040. You are officially clear of the Kitsap exclusion zone. WADS command is standing down the surface-to-air missile batteries." Jessica allowed herself a sharp exhale, relaxing her grip on the yoke by a fraction of an inch. "Copy that, Stryker. Tell NORAD to put their toys away. We're keeping this bird in the air." In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from pure hysteria to a suffocating, terrified silence. Richard Lawson, the platinum medallion businessman who had patronized Jessica an hour earlier, was curled tightly into his seat in 7B. He stared at the empty seat beside him, seat 7A, where the faded gray college hoodie still lay discarded. Every time the massive aircraft violently pitched or shuddered, Richard flinched, his eyes darting toward the reinforced cockpit door. He realized now that the fragile-looking blonde girl he had mocked was currently fighting a superhuman battle to keep 200 souls from plunging into the icy depths of the Pacific. "Captain Gallagher," Nancy's voice trembled from the galley behind the cockpit seats. The senior flight attendant had strapped herself into the jump seat, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. "Are we going to make it to an airport?" "We are currently vectoring toward McCord Field," Jessica replied, not turning her head, her eyes locked intensely on the tiny standby attitude indicator. "I need you to start preparing the cabin for a high-speed emergency landing. Brief the passengers on the brace position. Tell them to stow all sharp objects." "Understood," Nancy choked out, unbuckling her harness and moving back into the main cabin. "Valkyrie, be advised." Stryker's voice interrupted, and the relaxed tenor was gone, replaced by urgent, clinical military brevity. "I'm seeing a significant increase in the fluid vapor trailing from your right wing route. Oh, the tear in your hydraulic lines is widening. You are bleeding out." Jessica's stomach dropped. She reached up to the overhead panel, tapping the hydraulic system gauges. The analog needles confirmed her worst fear. "System B pressure is 0, Jessica reported grimly. "System A pressure is dropping rapidly. I've lost 50% of my remaining aileron authority, and the elevator is getting stiffer. It feels like I'm trying to pull the yoke through wet concrete." "How much time do you have before total hydraulic failure?" Stryker asked. Jessica ran the mental calculations, factoring in the leak rate and their current dynamic pressure. 3 minutes, maybe 4. If we lose System A completely, we lose the landing gear, the wheel brakes, and the last shred of flight control. We'll become a 70-ton lawn dart. She keyed the intercom. "Thompson, cross-check our DME to McCord Field." Thompson punched the coordinates into the battered flight management computer. His face turned ashen. "Distance is 38 nautical miles. At our current airspeed, we are 9 minutes out." Jessica closed her eyes for a microsecond. They didn't have 9 minutes. The math was absolute, and physics did not care about hope. They were going to lose their flight controls long before they ever saw the long, safe concrete runways of the military base. "Stryker," Jessica transmitted, her voice chillingly flat. "We aren't going to make McCord. We're going to fall out of the sky in exactly 4 minutes. I need an alternate piece of dirt, and I need it right now." Warning chimes echoed through the flight deck once again, shattering the brief illusion of stability. A blinding amber light illuminated on the center console. HYDSYSA low press. "I'm losing the yoke," Jessica shouted, her arms straining violently as the control column grew impossibly heavy. The hydraulic assist was failing, meaning she was now fighting the sheer aerodynamic force of the wind pushing against the flight control surfaces with nothing but her own raw muscle. "Valkyrie, turn to heading 095, Stryker ordered instantly, his fighter jet banking sharply to lead the way. "There's a small municipal strip just off the coastline, Bremerton National Airport. It's right on the edge of the water. Distance is barely 6 miles. "Bremerton," Thompson gasped, looking up from his charts. "Captain, that's a civilian airfield for Cessnas and private jets. The runway is only 6,000 feet long. We can't put a heavy 737 down on a strip that short. It's suicide." Jessica ignored the commercial co-pilot's panic. Her mind was already operating at maximum capacity, crunching the terrifying variables. They were flying entirely manually. They had no wing flaps available because the hydraulic system was dead. Without flaps to create extra lift at slow speeds, their approach speed would have to be horrifyingly fast, well over 180 knots, just to keep the heavy aircraft from stalling out and dropping like a stone. Landing a fully loaded, flapless Boeing 737 at nearly 200 miles per hour on a wet 6,000-foot runway was a mathematical impossibility. They would burn through the brakes in seconds and skid completely off the end of the pavement, entropy into the dense Washington pine forests. "It's Bremerton or the ocean, first officer," Jessica snapped, her voice radiating absolute, unyielding authority. "I prefer my chances on land. Give me asymmetric thrust, left engine forward. We are turning to intercept." The Boeing groaned, practically screaming as it skidded through the dense clouds, fighting its own crippled aerodynamics. "Stryker, I have no hydraulics to lower the landing gear," Jessica transmitted, fighting to keep her breathing steady. "We have to do a manual gravity drop. Get under my belly and confirm 3 green when I pull the release." "Copy that, Valkyrie. Sliding underneath you." The F-22 dropped away from the window, vanishing into the gray mist below their fuselage. "Thompson," Jessica barked. "Under the floorboards on your side. Lift the access panel. We are doing an alternate gear extension." Thompson unbuckled his harness, scrambling down onto his knees in the cramped space between the seats. He ripped up a small carpeted panel, exposing 3 heavy red mechanical handles. These cables physically bypassed the dead hydraulic pumps, releasing the mechanical uplocks that held the heavy landing gear inside the belly of the plane. "Pull them, all 3, hard," Jessica ordered. Thompson grabbed the handles and pulled with all his might. A massive, echoing thud vibrated through the entire airframe, followed by 2 more distinct, heavy mechanical slams. The sheer weight of the heavy steel struts and tires fell out of the fuselage, locking into place purely by the force of gravity. The drag was instantaneous. The Boeing violently decelerated, the nose dipping dangerously toward the water. "Power! Give me full power on both engines," Jessica screamed, pulling the yoke back to her chest to keep the nose from dropping. Thompson shoved the throttles forward. The engines roared, struggling to push the massive amount of drag through the thick, stormy air. "Valkyrie, this is Stryker," the radio crackled. "You have 3 gears down and locked, but listen to me carefully. The runway at Bremerton is unlit due to the storm knocking out local power grids. You are flying into a black hole. I am going to fly 100 yards ahead of your nose. You put your nose on my afterburners and you follow my tail right down to the concrete. Do you understand?" Jessica swallowed the lump of pure adrenaline in her throat. She was going to execute a blind, high-speed landing on a short runway by chasing the glowing exhaust of a stealth fighter jet through a thunderstorm. "Understood, Stryker. Lead the way." Suddenly, the F-22 rocketed up from beneath the Boeing, stabilizing perfectly in front of their windshield. Stryker engaged his afterburners, creating twin, blinding rings of blue and orange fire that pierced the gray fog like a pair of celestial beacons. "There he is," Jessica whispered, locking her eyes on the glowing exhaust. "Nancy, brace for impact. 2 minutes." In the back, Nancy's voice echoed over the PA system, shrill but clear. "Brace, brace, brace, heads down, stay down." 200 passengers, including Richard Lawson, folded themselves in half, grabbing their ankles and praying to whatever gods they believed in. The cabin was filled with the deafening roar of the wind, rushing over the lowered landing gear. In the cockpit, Jessica was completely in the zone. The hyper-focus that made her the deadliest F-22 pilot in the Air Force took over. The civilian world melted away. She wasn't a girl in a hoodie anymore. She was Valkyrie. 400 feet. Thompson read off the mechanical altimeter, his voice shaking. 300. Speed is 190 knots. We are way too fast, Captain. I know, Jessica replied coldly. Hold the throttles. Through the windshield, the thick clouds suddenly ripped apart. The driving rain lashed against the glass, and through the gloom, Jessica finally saw it. Directly ahead of Stryker's afterburners was a narrow, dark strip of black asphalt, surrounded by dense, imposing pine trees. It looked impossibly small, like a driveway rather than an airport runway. Valkyrie, you are over the threshold, Stryker commanded, his jet suddenly peeling away vertically, rocketing straight up into the storm clouds to clear her path. Put her down, now. Throttles to idle, Jessica commanded. Thompson ripped the levers back. Jessica hauled back on the yoke with every last ounce of strength in her shoulders, flaring the nose of the heavy aircraft, just as the concrete rushed up to meet them. Smash! The main landing gear slammed into the asphalt with a bone-jarring impact that blew out two of the right side tires instantly. The Boeing bounced violently, the wings flexing to their absolute structural limits before slamming back down onto the runway. Speed breaks up, maximum manual braking, Jessica screamed. She stood on the rudder pedals, burying the toe brakes into the floorboards. The anti-skid system had failed with the hydraulics. The remaining tires instantly locked up, screeching and smoking as they dragged across the wet runway. The end of the runway was rushing toward them at an impossible speed. The trees at the edge of the airport boundary were growing larger by the millisecond. "We're not going to stop," Thompson screamed, bracing his hands against the dashboard. Jessica refused to give up. She maintained her crushing pressure on the brakes, staring down the rapidly approaching tree line. She was Valkyrie, and she did not know how to lose. Screaming metal tore through the heavy rain as Flight 492 skidded blindly down the notoriously short civilian runway. Without the anti-skid system, the remaining main landing gear tires blew out in a rapid, deafening succession of cannon-like cracks. Sparks cascaded in a brilliant, terrifying shower against the darkened windows as bare, forged steel wheels ground directly against the wet asphalt. "Reverse thrust!" Jessica roared over the cacophony of destruction, her hands flying off the heavy yoke to grasp the throttle levers. Thompson was frozen in shock, staring at the rapidly approaching tree line. The runway was vanishing beneath them at over 150 miles per hour, and the massive pine trees at the boundary fence looked like a solid green wall of certain death. Refusing to wait, Jessica grabbed the reverse thrust levers herself, hauling them back to their maximum mechanical stops. The massive CFM56 engines shrieked as their cowlings deployed, violently redirecting the jet exhaust forward. The sudden deceleration threw both pilots violently against their shoulder harnesses. The entire airframe shuddered, groaning as if the aircraft was threatening to rip itself apart under the immense, conflicting physical forces. But it wasn't enough. "We're running out of pavement," Thompson screamed, his voice cracking into a hyperventilating sob. "Captain, we're going into the trees." Jessica's eyes darted to the end of the strip. Less than 1,000 feet of asphalt remained. At their current momentum, they were going to plow straight off the concrete, barrel through the chain-link perimeter fence, and disintegrate against the massive trunks of the Washington pines. A head-on collision at this speed would ignite the remaining jet fuel, ensuring no one in the cabin survived. She had less than 3 seconds to make a decision that contradicted every commercial flight manual ever written. "Brace for severe lateral impact," Jessica commanded. Instead of continuing the futile straight-line braking, Jessica violently kicked her left leg forward, stomping the left rudder pedal completely to the floorboards. At the exact same moment, she slammed the right engine throttle back to flight idle, while keeping the left engine in maximum reverse thrust. The heavy transport plane reacted violently to the massive asymmetric drag. The nose of the Boeing 737 whipped aggressively to the left. "What are you doing?" Thompson yelled, covering his face. Jessica was deliberately throwing a 70-ton commercial airliner into a high-speed drift. The aircraft skidded off the paved runway entirely, plowing sideways into the saturated muddy grass of the airfield's infield. The soft earth acted like a massive arrest or bed. Mud, water, and torn grass exploded into the air, covering the windshield in a thick, blinding brown paste. The landing gear struts screamed as they were subjected to terrifying lateral G-forces. The right wing dipped drastically, the engine cowling, scraping against the dirt and tearing a deep, jagged trench through the earth. Inside the cabin, passengers were thrown aggressively against the sides of their seats. Luggage bins that had survived the initial dive finally snapped open, sending suitcases raining down into the aisles. Richard Lawson squeezed his eyes shut, burying his head between his knees, bracing for the fiery explosion he was certain was coming. The Boeing groaned, skidding sideways through the mud for another 300 agonizing feet, throwing up a massive tidal wave of dirt. And then, with a final, violent jolt that rattled the teeth of everyone on board, the aircraft stopped. Total silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by the sound of rain hammering against the fuselage and the dying metallic whine of the jet engines spooling down. In the cockpit, Jessica sat perfectly still. Her chest heaved against her restraints. She stared blankly at the mud-caked windshield. Her hands, which had remained entirely steady through the entire terrifying ordeal, finally began to shake. She slowly reached up to the overhead panel, systematically cutting the fuel flow and engaging the emergency engine fire extinguishers to prevent any sparks from igniting the spilled hydraulic fluid. "First Officer Thompson," Jessica said, her voice dropping back to a quiet, breathless whisper. "Are you alive?" Thompson slowly lowered his hands from his face. He looked out the side window. The imposing trunks of the pine trees were barely 40 feet away from his window. They had missed the forest by a fraction of a second. "I think so," Thompson stammered, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. "You stopped it. You actually stopped it." Jessica unbuckled her harness, wincing as the bruised muscles in her shoulder flared in agony. "Don't thank me yet. We have a ruptured hydraulic system and a hot right engine. This bird could still catch fire." She grabbed the PA microphone, pressing the button firmly. "Nancy, initiate emergency evacuation. All doors, all slides. Get them off my plane." Pandemonium erupted in the cabin, but this time it was the organized chaos of survival. The emergency exit doors were shoved open, the inflatable yellow slides deploying with loud hisses into the freezing Washington rain. Jessica stepped out of the cockpit, navigating the debris-strewn aisle. She found Nancy and another flight attendant struggling to lift the unconscious bulk of Captain Miller. Without a word, Jessica stepped in, hooking her arms under the older man's shoulders, using her legs to help drag him toward the forward exit slide. "Go, go, go, leave your bags. Jump and slide." Nancy yelled at the terrified passengers. Richard Lawson stood at the edge of the forward door, shivering violently in his ruined designer suit. He looked back down the aisle, his eyes locking onto Jessica as she helped load the bleeding captain onto the slide. The oversized college hoodie was stained with mud and sweat, her blonde bun completely unraveled, plastered to the sides of her face by the dampness. She looked exhausted, fragile, and impossibly young. Yet, as Richard slid down into the mud, he couldn't shake the terrifying, awe-inspiring memory of her commanding the aircraft and the military fighter jets with the absolute authority of a combat veteran. Within 5 minutes, the Boeing 737 was empty. 200 shivering, sobbing passengers were huddled together on the wet grass of Bremerton National Airport, standing a safe distance from the smoking, crippled airliner. Jessica was the last one off the plane. She slid down the forward chute, landing knee-deep in the freezing mud. She didn't walk toward the crowd of passengers. Instead, she turned and stared back at the heavily damaged Boeing, clinically assessing the torn right wing and the massive trench they had carved into the earth. Before anyone could approach her, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades echoed through the low storm clouds. Emerging from the gray mist were 3 matte black UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. They didn't bear the markings of the Coast Guard or local police. They carried the subdued insignias of the United States Air Force Special Operations Command. They had scrambled directly from Naval Base Kitsap the moment Flight 492 touched down. The helicopters flared aggressively, landing in a tight perimeter around the downed airliner. The side doors slid open and heavily armed pararescue jumpers poured out, securing the area. Following closely behind them, the deafening roar of jet engines shattered the sky. Major Cole Stryker Harrison's F-22 Raptor executed a low, blistering flyby over the airfield, rocking its wings in a triumphant salute before pulling straight up into the clouds, heading back to base. From the lead Black Hawk, a tall, imposing figure stepped out into the rain. It was Colonel Robert Henderson, the commander of the Western Air Defense Sector. He was flanked by military medical personnel who immediately rushed toward the passengers to treat injuries. Henderson ignored the chaos. He marched directly through the mud toward the solitary figure standing near the nose of the Boeing. Richard Lawson, standing with a group of shivering passengers, watched the military brass approach the girl from seat 7A. He expected them to wrap a blanket around her, to treat her like a traumatized civilian. Instead, Colonel Henderson stopped 3 paces away from Jessica. He snapped his boots together, standing rigidly at attention in the driving rain, and raised his right hand in a razor-sharp salute. "Captain Gallagher," Henderson's voice boomed, carrying over the wind. "On behalf of NORAD and the United States Armed Forces, I am officially rescinding your administrative leave. That was the most extraordinary piece of flying I have ever witnessed." Jessica slowly returned the salute, her expression tired but intensely proud. "Just doing my job, Colonel. Though I prefer my jets with a bit more maneuverability and a lot less luggage." Henderson cracked a rare smile. "Stryker is waiting for you back at McCord. He owes you a drink for dragging him through that storm." Richard Lawson's jaw hit the floor. The other passengers stared in stunned silence. The girl they had dismissed, the kid they thought was hyperventilating in her window seat, was an elite military commander. She hadn't just been along for the ride, she was the architect of their survival. Slowly, Richard stepped forward from the crowd. He was soaked, freezing, and stripped of all his corporate arrogance. He walked up to Jessica, who was now holding a thermal blanket a medic had handed her. Richard started, his voice cracking. He looked at her military boots, her tactical watch, and the sheer, unyielding strength in her eyes. I told you to leave the heavy lifting to the men in the cockpit. Jessica pulled the blanket tightly around her shoulders. She looked at Richard, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips. "Don't worry about it, Richard," Jessica said softly, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of a Valkyrie. "It's basically just a big bus anyway." She turned and walked toward the waiting military helicopter, leaving the passengers of Flight 492 staring in awe at the girl in the hoodie who had conquered the sky. What an absolutely incredible, heart-stopping story of bravery, unmatched skill, and defying the odds. Captain Jessica Valkyrie Gallagher proved that true strength and heroism don't always look like what we expect. Disguised in an oversized hoodie and sitting quietly in economy class, she stepped up when disaster struck, saving 200 lives by executing a landing that even veteran commercial pilots considered entirely impossible. It's a powerful reminder to never underestimate the quiet ones. You never know when you might be sitting next to a highly trained military hero. If this intense, true-to-life aviation drama kept you on the absolute edge of your seat, please show your support. Like this video, share it with your friends and family who love thrilling survival stories, and make sure to subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss another epic tale. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were on Flight 492? Stay safe, and we will see you in the next one.